We're looking at the job of being a black journalist in modern newsrooms here in Jacksonville and how that role has changed and continued to change. I'm joined now by a group of local journalists dedicated to being a powerful voice for communities who are underrepresented or voiceless. Start with Sylvia Perry, editor of the Jacksonville Free Press, a black weekly newspaper that has published for decades now, 4 decades. Welcome, Sylvia.
Good morning.
Will Brown, specializing in covers issues of race, poverty, and inequality for Florida Today. Hey, Will.
Good morning.
Nice to have you again. Mia Tomer, junior at the University of North Florida, major in journalism. Hey, Mia.
Hi, good morning.
And we are waiting on a couple of our guests who have hit a little bit of I-95 traffic. Anthony Austin from First Coast News and Marylin Parker from News4Jax will be joining us in just a moment. I want to start with you, Sylvia. You are the editor of a historically black newspaper. How does that focus shape your coverage and the stories that you tell? Do you tell different stories or do you tell stories differently?
Well, a little bit of both. We have the dual challenge of not only presenting a valid perspective, but also making that perspective of importance to our readers and why that subject matter is important to them. So it has that dual slant of why I should know this and why you want to know.
How important is it to have a black paper in town for a very, significant population here of, black residents and black journalists?
Absolutely of importance. I mean, as it goes back to the beginning of black journalism back into the early 1800s, we served the voice of the voiceless. And if we don't print it, if it's not shared, oftentimes that story or that slant or that way, that perspective is not shared with the mainstream.
Anthony Austin, welcome. Thanks for arriving despite traffic.
I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you. You've been in this business now for almost 20 years?
15, actually.
15,
it
all
feels
right.
like 20, though, but close enough.
The Asian dog years.
Right.
You're from Texas originally, but you've been in Jacksonville for about 10 years?
8 years in January.
8 years, okay.
But
My math is terrible.
That's okay. It's close enough.
Does being a black journalist give you any special sense of obligation or purpose?
And it does, because I'll tell you, coming from Texas, my first job, I worked for a CBS affiliate in my hometown, actually, of Tyler, Texas, and I was the only black journalist in the entire newsroom. And I felt like I had a sense of responsibility because I know people meant well, but I still remember this one story. My boss came up to me and she was asking me to do an interview with someone. And she was like, "I'm not sure if you're familiar with this person in your community." And I said, "Huh." It's like, that's a interesting phrase to use, your community. So right then, I knew she meant well, but she was already kind of separating me from everyone else. And when it comes to covering news, especially where I was in East Texas, I think it was so important to represent my community in a positive manner because no one really in that newsroom kind of understood. And once again, I don't think it was intentional, but they just didn't have that background to understand why it was so important to cover our black community.
Marylin Parker, I want to bring you into the conversation. Thank you also for arriving despite I-95 today.
Yes, thank you.
You're a broadcast journalist at News4Jax. The numbers across the industry really show black journalists are underrepresented in newsrooms. Just about 6.5% of reporting journalists. Was this something that you thought about before or when you were deciding to become a reporter?
Absolutely. Graduating from North Carolina A&T, it's a big HBCU. And one of the things that I was taught was to look at the newsroom you're going into first. So I always paid attention to demographics. One, because it's simply said, but representation does matter. People who can advocate for me and people who can step aside and say, you know what, maybe I don't understand this, so maybe I can ask someone else and they can guide me. And I think that transcends into the way that we present the news and the way the community receives us. So it is a priority to me. I look at who's in charge, and I look at their thought process. When I have that conversation, I'm always asking, how important and why is diversity and having different faces in your newsroom important to you? And I take that answer, and I have follow-up questions. I hit them right back with it because, again, how we look on TV should be a reflection of our community. And I think that is where we get into the conversation of, trusting our news and having someone you can relate to. So it is a big priority for me.
Will Brown, you cover all kinds of stories. You've worked for the Business Journal, you worked for the St. Augustine Record, you've covered sports, you've covered all kinds of news. But for Jacksonville Today, your beat is specifically focused on race and related issues. How do you approach that task, and what appeals to you about that specialized beat?
I love the beat. It's because there's so many different stories and people here in Jacksonville. For me, the biggest thing is being present. Everything from, the melanin market, when they have markets, I might not write a story, but it just might be go walk up and down A. Philip Randolph and get some ice cream while I'm at it. It's, for example, tomorrow night, Raines is playing Jackson and boys basketball for a trip to the state semifinals. I can't in good conscience say, hey, tell me these really hard, potentially negative things about this community if I don't show up for the joyful things as well. And so it's all about being present. And by being present and just willing to have conversations with people, sometimes they're far off the record. Sometimes they're so far off the record, it's like, yeah, I know, we didn't talk. But being present allows me to do that. And I just love the opportunity to be able to sometimes wander around the east side or go up to Northwest Jacks or go hang out on the west side. And when I say hang out, I mean go listen to people and let them tell me what's going on instead of assuming what's going on.
Mia Tomer, you are working into the field of journalism as a third-year student at UNF, and your ambition is to become a journalist. What have you been told about, things that you might encounter in this field that could be problematic? What do you have working journalists of color that you are close to that advise you about, concerns, perhaps embarking on this line of work?
Right. I did have a professor. She was African American, and she had history with reporting. She was able to. Oh, I'm sorry. She was like a reporter at some point in her career, and she did talk to us about challenges she faced, like while being Black. And she did mention something that Marylin was bringing up, that you want to look at what the newsroom looks like. You want to, before you go into the job, you want to see the diversity of it. And so she always warned us about that. She warned us Black girls about our hair. She said she had a whole issue with that. And so that's something I've had in the back of my mind for okay, that might be something that comes up. One thing I thought about myself that would be I'm a little fearful of is being put in a box. I appreciate all of what y'all do, the rest of you, for putting out the Black stories. That's important, and that's what we should be doing. But I want to have the creativity to do whatever story I want to do at that point. Because sometimes I'll get put in a box in class. It's here are the list of stories that y'all can choose from, and I'll get put with the more Black pushed story because I'm Black and nobody else is. And it's okay, I get it, but I kind of want to write what I want to write about, So that's the only thing that I've faced personally right now, but it could happen in the future again,
Anthony, I want to ask you about that. I mean, I worked with you at First Coast News. I always thought of it as a diverse newsroom, but that's coming from a white person's perspective. I don't know if it reads that way to Black journalists and producers and the people that work in that newsroom as diverse or diverse enough. But also, to Mia's point, being put into a box. How does that play out? And you're an anchor.
Yeah, and she makes a great point there. And I will say, Ann, coming here to Jacksonville, First Coast News is probably the most diverse newsroom I've worked in, especially now. I think we've done a better job of making sure that our newsroom is diverse. I can say I worked in North Carolina, I worked in Texas. That was not the case. So I understand what she's saying about being put in a box, because I felt very early on in my journalism career, when you're the only Black person in the newsroom, you're pushed towards those stories. If something happens in the Black community, send Anthony. He's going to relate to them. He understands this. And I don't necessarily feel like she's saying, I want to cover the stories I want to cover. Now, I think I probably do have a better perspective sometimes on covering a story in a Black community, but I want everyone in the newsroom to go out in that community so they can experience that as well, so they can relate to the people in the Black community, so you're not just coming over there. Because so many times we hear from people in different neighborhoods, you only come over here when there's crime, when there's something bad. Why are you not sharing the positive stories? And they need to see the journalists in our newsroom, who don't necessarily look like me, come into the community to share those positive stories.
We've got a call. Eric in Arlington, good morning. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Yeah, two comments real quick. I think people these days would rather be entertained than informed. And as a result, we've got like millions of people every day getting their information from questionable sources like Joe Rogan. And so I wonder if you could comment on that. And then the second thing is, I understand about diversity. Diversity is important. But I think what gets lost in a diversity conversation is diversity of income. Is I think where the focus needs to be, and not diversity of skin color. There's a lot of people out here that are not being represented, and people like me. I live in the 32254. I live in a neighborhood that is which is impoverished.
Yeah.
And so I don't just want black, folks that are black report on the news. I want it to be about people that are poor.
Right. Thanks, Eric.
On the news.
I'm going to steer that to Will, because not only are you covering issues of race, but you cover issues of poverty and inequality generally.
And Eric brings up a fantastic point of it's not about, Northwest Jacksonville has really pushed, and the East Side as well is really working to become a mixed income neighborhood, because previously when those predominantly black neighborhoods were exclusively black, they were neighborhoods with people of all incomes. And as the wealthier folks moved out, or the people with more means moved out, they became pockets of poverty. And so one of the things I do is speak to developers, and not just developers, speak with people whose housing situation isn't the most secure, or people whose food situation is not the most secure. Or when I pick up my son who goes to a school in Northwest Jacksonville, it's taking the scenic route to kind of lay eyes on what's going on. And it's Eric's point of that it's important to be able to be present, and it's important to be able to get that trust so people will open up to you. Because sometimes folks will say, oh, I have all these issues, but yeah, don't use my name. Because sometimes they'll feel embarrassed. They'll feel that they'll be put out there in a way that almost like the Anton Dobson meme, of years and years ago. Someone I think in Alabama was speaking to a TV reporter, and he forcefully said a few things, and then it became this meme that's been on the internet for a decade. So I think being present and developing that trust is a way to be able to share the stories of people of diverse income backgrounds.
Sylvia, I want to ask you, because your paper has, as part of its mission, trying to tell the good stories of the people that you cover. And, to Anthony's point, there's often a sense in some communities, if they're under-resourced, that people are only reporting on them when there's problems. How does the work that you do try to bridge that perception?
Well, we remain trying to, with the focus of education and empowerment, and then engagement as well. So we choose to focus mainly on the positive sides of the news. The old misnomer, if it bleeds, it leads. You can read about the crime, who has done what, who shot Johnny, etc., anywhere. That's going to lead on the front pages of mainstream media, the local, everywhere. So it's our job to root out those other stories that you will not find. And that's where you'll find that in the Free Press, and that's what we choose to focus on.
Marylin, you've been nodding forcefully about some of these comments that you've been hearing.
I'm a nodder.
Yeah, particularly the issue of being present. Can you talk a little bit about that? The job of a daily journalist, for people who don't know, is an incredible grind. It is nonstop. It is every day, all day, everything you can do just to try to get the news out.
Absolutely.
So how do you champion representation, being present, when you're being pulled in a bunch of different directions?
I think I champion it by dipping my finger in as many different things as I can. One of the stories that has really sat with me on my heart and on my mind, because of the different parameters and all of the different elements of the story that could be brought to light, is this whole case with Virgilio Aguilar Mendez. That is another situation where there is a minority, and no, we don't look the same, but we are both considered minorities. And there is a civil lawsuit now that has been filed, and it is addressing a language barrier in relations with people and who speak different languages and the police.
And we should be clear, just for people who don't know the backstory, an officer basically stopped or detained Mr. Aguilar. He was not doing anything at the time, but there was a scuffle that ensued with an officer in St. Johns County, and that officer ended up having a fatal heart attack.
Yes, tragic. heartbreaking. And it was something that shook the community, obviously, because there was no answers immediately. We did not know what happened. You know, we didn't get the autopsy until several months later. But when we got the body camera video, I think that changed things. I think that opened up a whole other layer of questions, because people would reach out to me and they would say, this guy's not even speaking Spanish. We learned later that it's a dialect of Spanish. It's ma'am. And we were like, well, what is that? And so it just brought on a slew of different things. And I think that being able to talk to our growing Hispanic and Latino community here in Jacksonville about that case was another layer of representation. Mm-hmm. I'm doing stories now where I'm so glad that our newsroom, we have, I think, 3 people who now speak Spanish, you know, in our newsroom. And I've been doing stories where the goal has been, okay, can we do a Spanish version of this story and post it on news4jax.com? Can we put it on News4Jax Plus and, you know, tell that story so that they don't have to only see it in one language? I think it's about inclusion. And I'm grateful that now I'm finding that we have managers who are willing to do this and take that jump. That is important too, the diversity in management. It's not just, you know, the faces. We have to have diverse management who are willing to hear us and want to implement these ideas. So I am grateful for News4Jax in that aspect.
Well,
And to Marylin's point, you know, we just did a story at Jacksonville Today. 17% of people in Duval County speak a language beside English.
Yes.
And that number has grown year over year. And so we as journalists, whether we're black, white, brown, tall, short, small, rich or poor, we'd be doing a disservice if we weren't telling those stories.
Yes.
So that's the importance of diversity. And I'm not saying this to toot my own horn. Like, you know, Jacksonville Today published a story about a boys soccer team that has children who speak 10 different languages. All on a 20-person team, 10 different languages. And until last night, they were undefeated. Mm-hmm. So it's a show of you can do things together if you take the time to go listen, learn, and tell those stories.
we've got a call. Stanley on the north side. Good morning, Stanley.
Yes, good morning to everybody. Yes, my main concern here, because I used to be a community blogger for the Florida Time Union, Jacksonville Journey. Sorry about that. But my main concern here, when it comes to the news, it's pick and choose. It's selective. And when it comes to, we don't just want the African-American community news. We want diverse news, but it needs to be fair and balanced. In Jacksonville, it's not fair and balanced. And I've been in Jacksonville. I'm a native over 60-some years. And I'm a community activist in this community. And I'm in City Hall 5 days a week. Mm. But I have never really seen any news people really in City Hall addressing the community activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. Appreciate it. We're talking with 5 local Black journalists about covering communities of color amid growing industry pressures, threats, demands for racial justice. If you have questions or experiences that you want to share, you can join the conversation at 904-549-2937. We know some folks are having phone issues this morning out in the community, so you can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on Instagram, Facebook, or X. Anthony, I want to ask you, being an anchor in a newsroom, you are a reporter, you turn stories all the time, but there's kind of an elevated role to being an anchor. You get to be a little bit of a spokesperson, a champion of issues. Have you ever had, difficult moments where you've had to be the conscience of the newsroom, or, steer coverage that you thought perhaps wasn't hitting the mark in terms of being just or appropriate when covering communities of color?
That's a very good question, Ann, and I'm kind of thinking to myself right now, where do I begin on that? Because I feel like as a Black journalist, we are taught to not be biased, to represent, everyone. But sometimes when things hit home, when you see someone who looks like you, who could be your grandmother, your grandfather, your uncle, your brother, your sister, going through this tough situation in a newscast, it hits home to you. But, you're not supposed to have any emotions, especially when we were going through the entire, social justice movement. And when we see cases of police brutality and you hear the facts surrounding the case, and it just, you think to yourself, what if that was me in that situation? How do we respond to this? How do we go and talk to those grieving families? What are the right questions that we ask? So I'm always thinking about that, even when I'm on the anchor desk, when we're in editorial meetings. What if that was me? What if that was my family member? And I try to remind all of the journalists in our newsroom, put yourself in their shoes. What if that was happening to you? What would you want the community to know? How would you want a reporter to speak to you? What would you want them to share about the situation?
There have been, as you note, there's been a lot of really difficult stories that have been in the news over the last several years, and before that as well. But in this community, we all covered the Dollar General massacre,
Right.
which was a direct racist attack in the heart of Jacksonville, and it's an incredibly difficult story to hear, but to tell it as a Black journalist is a unique challenge. Will.
It was, and but the when I say the beauty of Black journalism is the funeral for Angela Carr was tough, and I sat right next to Marylin, and she was helping me not cry when Total Praise was coming on. I about lost it, and she just looked at me. I was like, "Okay, get it together. You can do this." And just that quick moment, it was probably no more than 5 seconds, but that quick moment, I was like, "Okay." Was allowed me to focus, and I'm sure it helped her as well, because I mean, a 52-year-old grandmother goes and has a ride share, and they can't have a casket at the memorial service. I mean, it's still tough. And I've said this to people privately, but my son's school is a 10-minute walk from there. It's so realizing all of that, it informed my reporting. And so when I saw the families, and everyone here touched on that story, when I saw the families, I would say, "I'm really sorry. I'm not here to talk to you. I'm just here to say I'm sorry. If you'd like to talk to me, there's always a way for you to find me. But I'm not going to say anything to you right now, other than I'm sorry." And just saying that, I've seen I've seen some members of Mr. Galleon's family over the months, and it's just like this quick head nod of, "I appreciate you just giving us a moment to exhale." And I'm not saying a white journalist or a Latino journalist or an Asian journalist could not have done that. I'm not saying that at all. They could have. What I'm saying is knowing full well that all of us are very melanated people, that could have been us. And thus, I think that informed how we approached the story to make sure that we told it in a way that was honest, with context, with clarity, but humane as well.
Marylin, I want to ask you about that because, being a support network for each other in the field, you're not necessarily being competitors at that point. You are, offering some solidarity and some assistance.
Absolutely. And that was I'm glad you remember that. I didn't know if you remember that or not, but
I did.
yeah. And also, I think back to the conversation that you and I had when Dollar General reopened. You and I were right next to each other again. And so seeing other journalists of color out in the field, it does give me comfort. I remember just last week when they did the procession for Kennedy Sanders, the soldier killed over in Jordan. And there was a young journalist there who worked at my old station. And I said, "Hey, young sister, I see you. If you need me, call me. I'm here," and she was so grateful to have that. And so I think it's just a matter of camaraderie. I am competitive, but I'm never stop. I can be competitive. It's just my nature, but I'm always willing to help any journalist who I see. But in those moments where it's so raw and it's so we're walking into the Dollar General where this was a targeted attack. Yes, any journalist would have asked those questions. Well, you're absolutely right, but this was targeted. This was meant for Black people, and I never wanted that to be misinterpreted by anyone when we did that story. And so the big conversation that you and I were having was, it's just unfortunate because there are so many people in that community that need that store, that's their only source of grocery. We talk with people who came up just to Dollar General to say, we don't want it here. But I'm like, no, I just spoke with this man who's on a walker and he does not have transportation. And now they have groceries in there, and it's such a stain, but it can be something much bigger on the other side. And so having those two instances in the story meant so much to me. And I think that was the way we were able to capture the feeling of the community in that area, because so many people who don't even know. There are people in Jacksonville who have never even been on that street, who have never gone down by Edward Waters, who don't even know what it looks like. And they don't care. There's a lot of people who just don't care. And I think it's our job. My main three things are passion, authenticity, and integrity. And if we can accomplish that as journalists in everything we do, then I think I can tap on you just a little bit and make you care just a little bit. You know, it may not impact you or affect you directly, but I want to try and make you care. That's my goal.
Mia, at the educational level at UNF, or among your peers, do you think that there is enough being done to teach upcoming journalists about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the newsroom and in coverage?
Other than the professor that I spoke about previously, she was the only one that kind of really touched on it. Yeah, she was African American, and then all the other professors are like not, and so it's just really about like, journalism. Nothing about like, we don't really get into like what could happen like race wise and stuff like that. I do have a professor now who does like acknowledge it. She likes to like talk to the colored students, and she likes to make sure that we are like heard, and like she'll suggest like, hey, if you want to do something like about your community, like go ahead and like do that. Like I want you to like have that voice. So she's really good with that. Otherwise there's like not much of like that being done.
Would you like to see more?
Absolutely. It's like kind of like it's really quiet about that, honestly, at the school. So you don't really hear much about it. It's not really brought up. Yeah.
Anthony, just briefly, I want to ask you about, changes that you're seeing in the industry. If you think that even as stories perhaps get difficult or more difficult, if there is enough of a resource for kind of the emotional side of these difficult stories for people, particularly when you're dealing, with breaking news and you're delivering just, very difficult subjects.
That's a good question. I think we are getting better as an industry about making sure that there's mental health resources available for journalists when we go through these tough situations. And I kind of want to go back to the Dollar General situation that we were talking about, because our newsroom had a conversation about the shooter's manifesto, if we were going to share what was inside of it, because it was filled with so much hate and just, I don't even know how to describe it. And I remember our news director, who is a woman of color, emailed us and said, if you read this and you need some counseling, if you need someone to talk to, we're going to make that available for you. But as a newsroom, we decided not to share what was in there. But there was also a part of me as a black journalist. I wanted people to know that this is 2024, and you still have people who believe like this, who still talk like this, who still use the N-word and all kinds of different language, and that believe that black people or minorities in general should not exist, that we should not be here. And so I kind of went back and forth with myself that day, thinking to myself, why are we not sharing this? We need to let people know about this, let them know. But, my coworkers are saying not to share it. And just kind of going back to that mental health side of it, you'll lose your mind sometimes, in this business, just to be honest. But I think we are getting better as journalists, as a newsroom in this business, to just talk about it, to talk about these things so we can have some kind of peace of mind at the end of the day.
Well, Anthony Austin, Sylvia Perry, Marylin Parker, Will Brown, Mia Tomer, thank you all so much for this discussion. It was great talking to all of you.